For 6 centuries, the name outsiders gave them meant Egyptian, a guess, not a fact, made by people who saw dark hair and unfamiliar dress and assumed the nearest exotic origin they could think of. The name stuck. It became the root of the English word still used for them today, still carrying that original error inside it like a splinter no one removed. But the name they used for themselves was never that. It was something else entirely, and for centuries nobody outside the group asked what it actually meant, or where a word like that could have come from. The Romani people have been called many things by many nations. They have rarely been asked what they call themselves, and why. The accepted story, the one repeated in European textbooks for generations, is a story about arrival. It says the Roma appeared in the Balkans sometime around the 14th century. Byzantine records, then Ottoman ones, describe groups of skilled metalworkers, entertainers, and traders moving through the region, distinct in language and custom from their neighbors. From there, the story spreads outward, into Hungary, into the Iberian Peninsula, into Britain and Scandinavia, carried by trade routes and displacement over the following 2 centuries. Along the way came the folk explanation for the misleading name, a belief, widespread and wrong, that this wandering population had come from Egypt. Historians have long since corrected the record on that point. The itinerant lifestyle, the persecution that followed it, the deep and often violent marginalization across a dozen countries, all of that is documented with unusual thoroughness for a medieval European minority. What the textbooks are far quieter about is where the story starts before the Balkans. Long before geneticists went looking, linguists had already noticed something the maps couldn't explain. That something was the language. Romani, the language spoken across dozens of dialects by Roma communities from Spain to Russia, is not a Balkan language, not a Slavic one, not even loosely related to the languages surrounding it for the past 700 years. It is Indo-Aryan, structurally and lexically closest to languages spoken today in northwestern India. Here is where it gets complicated. A genome-wide study published in Current Biology in 2012, led by researchers including Isabel Mendizabal and David Comas, analyzed DNA from 13 Romani groups sampled across Europe and found the same signal the linguists had flagged decades earlier, now written into the body itself. The study traced the entire European Romani population to a single founder group that originated in north or northwestern India roughly 1,500 years ago. Not a myth, not a folk memory, but a measurable genetic bottleneck with a date attached. A haplogroup, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, is something like a surname passed down not on paper, but inside the cell. A lineage marker inherited largely intact for thousands of years, letting researchers trace an unbroken thread back toward its point of origin. Multiple studies have found Indian-associated mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages persisting in Roma populations across Europe at frequencies far higher than in the surrounding host populations. A genetic accent, if you want to call it that never fully faded no matter how many centuries passed or how many borders were crossed. A population living entirely within Europe, speaking European state languages, holding European citizenship for over 600 years, carrying inside it a signature that has never stopped pointing towards South Asia. Not faded, preserved. The first theory, and the one with the most direct evidentiary support, is straightforward: a single migration. The Mendizabal team's data suggests one relatively small founding population left the Indian subcontinent around 1,500 years ago, moved with what researchers describe as moderate gene flow through the Near or Middle East, and entered Europe through the Balkans beginning around 900 years ago, a compressed, high-speed migration rather than a slow, multi-generational drift. It is a clean model. It matches the linguistic evidence almost perfectly, and it gives the population a coherent timeline: leave, travel, arrive, settle. But researchers are careful to frame this as a strong signal, not a complete answer. The single migration model struggles to fully explain just how genetically distinct different Romani subgroups became from one another once they were inside Europe. Spanish Roma, Balkan Roma, and Baltic Roma carry meaningfully different genetic substructures today, more than a simple one-time arrival would predict on its own. The second theory is more complicated, and it starts where the first one runs out of explanatory power. This is the part the records don't explain on their own. Rather than one clean settlement, the genetic data is consistent with a pattern of repeated founder events, the population fragmenting again and again as smaller groups broke off and settled in different regions, each new branch descending from an increasingly narrow genetic base. This pattern shows up with unusual clarity in Romani medical genetics. Researcher Luba Kalajeva and colleagues spent decades documenting a cluster of rare inherited disorders that appear almost exclusively in specific Romani communities: hereditary motor and sensory neuropathy, LOM, a demyelinating nerve disorder traced to a single mutation on chromosome 8, a distinct form of congenital myasthenia carried by a specific mutation in the CHRNE gene, congenital cataracts, facial dysmorphism neuropathy syndrome, found almost nowhere outside Balkan Romani populations. Each of these traces back to one ancestral mutation, multiplied across generations of a small, repeatedly isolated gene pool. The data doesn't confirm exactly how many separate founder events occurred. It only fails to rule out that there were several. What the second theory explains well is the internal diversity. What it still doesn't explain is why the isolation lasted as long as it did. Why, 7 centuries after arrival, in dozens of different countries, with different laws and different neighbors, the endogamy held. The third theory is the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, because it risks sounding like it reduces centuries of human suffering to a statistic. But the data doesn't let it be dismissed either. It is this: the genetic isolation of Roma populations may not be purely a matter of internal cultural preference. It may have been substantially reinforced, generation after generation, by the discrimination and forced segregation imposed from outside. Laws in multiple European states that restricted Roma movement, intermarriage, land ownership, even settlement itself, for centuries at a stretch. Exclusion enforced from without and endogamy practiced from within are not easy to separate in the genetic record. They can produce an identical signature. Researchers studying this are careful not to reduce a long history of persecution to a footnote in a population genetics paper. But the honest answer is that the data cannot currently distinguish how much of the isolation was chosen and how much was imposed. That question stays open. It is not resolved here. Picture a settlement on the edge of the Balkans sometime in the 1200s. Wood smoke over low stone houses. A river valley just cold enough this time of year that breath shows in the air at dawn. In the market square, a language moves between stalls that none of the neighboring villages can follow. Not a dialect of anything spoken within 100 miles, just entirely its own. A blacksmith works metal his grandfather also worked, in a technique his grandfather also learned somewhere further east than anyone in this valley has ever traveled. None of them know the word haplogroup. None of them will ever hear the word Balkans used the way historians will use it 8 centuries later. They know they are foreigners here. They do not know that their bodies are already carrying a demographic signature precise enough that scientists working with machines that don't exist yet will one day read it back across 15 centuries and land almost to the region on where their great-great-grandparents began walking. Here is where the story stops being simple. For 600 years, the thing used to justify excluding Roma communities, the insistence that they were foreign, that they didn't truly belong to the nations they lived in, that their difference was permanent and unassimilable, was treated by those doing the excluding as an insult, a justification for expulsion, forced labor, and worse. The genetic record does confirm the difference is real. It does not confirm what that difference was ever supposed to mean. Not by years, by centuries, the isolation forced on Roma communities across Europe did something its architects never intended. It kept the genetic signal legible. A population that had been fully absorbed into its host societies, intermarried freely, culturally diffused within a few generations, would have left scientists almost nothing to trace. The very exclusion that caused so much documented harm is unintentionally part of the reason this migration remains one of the most precisely dated and clearly mapped in all of human population genetics. A geneticist working today can point to a date, a region, a route, with a level of confidence rare for a migration this old. A composite of the researchers who've worked this data for 2 decades put it plainly in one interview. The Roma aren't a puzzle piece that doesn't fit the picture. They're a piece with the manufacturer's stamp still legible on the back, while most of the other pieces had it worn off centuries ago. Every population carries a version of this same record, written at different resolutions, some clearer than others, most partially erased by intermarriage, migration, and time. What the Roma case exposes is how unstable the categories built on top of that record really are: nationality, race, the assumption that geography and appearance and ancestry all line up neatly if you trace them back far enough. They usually don't. A group can live somewhere for 6 centuries, speak its languages fluently, hold its passports, and still carry a legible thread back to a subcontinent most of their neighbors have never associated them with. If that's true here, it raises an uncomfortable question about how many other settled origin stories, repeated confidently in classrooms for generations, would come apart the same way under the same kind of scrutiny. Scientists have mapped the DNA history of nearly every population on Earth, filling in migration routes once left as blank space on the map. This is one thread that still refuses to fold neatly into the picture, and the more precisely it gets measured, the more it seems to ask the question back.